Hello and welcome to Mystics and Nuons. Today I'm joined by Valentina, my wife Valentina has been on a couple other episodes, and we're very excited to have Dr. Eben Alexander on the show. Thank you so much for coming on.
Well, Gabe and Val, thanks for having me on. It's great to be with you both today.
Thank you.
So I guess we'll start. I usually like to start and explain like how your work came into my life, and then I know Val has got a different story.
Sure.
I was going through a Kundalini awakening. Are you familiar with?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So I was going through that like almost 4 years ago now. Didn't know anything about that like space. It was my friend that said, hey, you should look this up. And somewhere during the beginning of it, and I came from a very like materialist, skeptical, poo-pooed a lot of like pseudoscience stuff. Even my mom talking about EMDR, I would often roll my eyes because like it just didn't seem like it made sense. So I was processing a lot of this stuff with her, and then she's come along a little bit with me on this journey, and she sent me one of your interviews, I think with like some therapy like association. I forget which one, but it was a very good hour and a half where you just kind of went over not only your near-death experience, but just kind of how it integrates into everything. And so that was one of the first really good like integrations of like spirituality, science, all the stuff I was experiencing. And so I really appreciate what you've done and just blending and integrating things in a rigorous way.
Well, I'm glad that's helped you. I think it's also helped a lot of people. I hear from tons of scientists, physicists and engineers and doctors and nurses, who are very grateful for this, because it's clear that our little materialist model really just doesn't cut it. It doesn't explain so much, and yet there are worldviews that are emerging from all this that make sense and that we can actually work with. And the great news is it completely enlivens the concept of free will among sentient beings. And that to me is very exciting, because the materialism that I worshipped before my coma, and I do not use that term lightly, had very little room for free will. They were assuming it was all chemical reactions, electron fluxes in the brain. They were all following the laws of physics, chemistry, biology. Where would you inject free will? So I found it very refreshing that there are many scientists now who are waking up to the big implications of things like quantum physics and entanglement and the brain-mind connection in a much more kind of top-down way that makes a lot more sense.
Yeah. I think you want to share your...
Yeah. So for me, I've never been materialistic. I always thought that everything was alive, but I'm from Italy, and I grew up, Catholic. We don't have much indigenous culture there. So I didn't have any framework I know there was an explanation of things that I didn't have at that time. And I couldn't find any explanation through the church or through people that I knew that actually made sense to me. So I was still searching. And when I came across your book, Proof of Heaven, I was in London, and actually my ex's mom gave this book to him, and then I read it shortly after, and I found it super beautiful, and really it gave me a lot of hope. And I started to understand more about how this universe might work. But it was, I think, 10, 12 years ago at this point, the first time that I read it. And it took me a long time actually to fully understand it. Well, the first time that I read it, I just felt a lot of hope, and it was very beautiful, but it took me a long time to actually put everything together. And now that we actually read it for our book club, I said, oh, that's what he meant. Now I can actually understand it fully, at least. Yeah.
Well, I'm so glad that it's helped you, and I hear a similar story from many people. In fact, a lot of people contacted me originally after it came out and after I started giving talks on this, and they said there was something about the way I told the story, something about, and all of a sudden it would awaken in them some very deep memory, something that they weren't even conscious in their adult life of experiencing, and yet it was kind of a remarkable, like a past life memory or something like that was really strong and solid. And that's where they found the book to be so useful, was it served as kind of a catalyst to remind them of something they themselves had been through, and yet often it had been suppressed from memory. So I think it's a resonance. It's a heart resonance. It's one of the reasons I love telling the story verbally too, because I know I heard early on that people would tell me that they'd read the book Proof of Heaven, the physical book, and they'd also listened to the audio book Proof of Heaven. Now they have exactly the same words. There's not a single word that's changed. And yet they said they got so much more out of the audio book. And to me, that was just kind of sharing that there's something about this communication that almost transcends the words. And that's why I think Proof of Heaven really struck a chord with people. I mean, when it first came out, it was a kind of a smashing, unexpected success, in the publishing world, because no NDE book had ever done that. And Proof of Heaven was at the top of the New York Times nonfiction list for almost 2 years, including 42 weeks at #1. So it was, and then it's published in more than 40 languages. And I'm just, the only reason I share all that is it obviously struck a chord and resonated with a big chunk of humanity. And of course, it's not, truth be told, I didn't like the title at all when they came to me with Proof of Heaven. The title I had taken to them was N of One, like a medical case, N of One. That would have sold about 50 books probably. So Proof of Heaven was audacious enough, but I told them it was a ridiculous title because I said there's no such thing as proof in science. You only have hypothesis, and you refine hypothesis. Proof works in mathematics, but not in science. And heaven was such a buzzword. And I knew what I was trying to describe was far beyond any kind of religious ideology. This is about the nature of the universe, the nature of reality, the kind of underlying nature of who we are and how we fit together, and very meaning of our existence. So it was very gratifying to me that it resonated so deeply with people. But it just shows that materialism is on very thin ice. And certainly many of the scientists I work with would tell you that materialism died decades ago. And in many ways, the Nobel Prize in 2022 for entanglement to John Clauser, Alan Aspect, and Anton Zeilinger absolutely says we're done with local realism. We're done with space-time as the ultimate theater of operations of science. And we now realize there's something deeper. There are interconnections that go beyond all that. And for me, as a scientist, all you have to do is look at life reviews and studied scientifically, and you realize we need a huge reset on our understanding of reality, because they paint a very powerful picture of a universe that has the capability of demonstrating to us every bit of our existence through multiple lifetimes. And it's up to us to really make sense of it. But the universe is there to support us in it. And this is why meditation and prayer, to me, are very important. Going within, you're actually going into the mind of the universe, not just your own little mind, because, in this emerging model, mind is primary and we're all interconnected through mind. And so is the universe at large.
Yeah, I think what I like about your approach, and to me, coming also from a very, very skeptical mindset, like I needed at least some framework for things to make sense before I open myself up to, tearing down your whole belief structure and putting something new. And that not everybody's like that. Like with Vale, it's amazing to me, like how much stuff she just like intuitively understands. Like I'm writing a book on entropy and I'm like using Stephen Wolfram's models and like trying to do this. And she's like, oh yeah, I mean, of course that's the case,
Mhm.
but to me, I'm like, yeah, but we need to like find a way to explain it so that the people who are like only work logically step to step. Um, and so I think, yeah, your book, I think, helps both sides. It helps people like her who is like, yeah, of course this is true. I just don't know how to convince my like skeptical friend who just uses all these words and like all this theory and that. So they have at least some, they start to get initiated into, okay, yes, it's true, but this is how it works within the words of like, mainstream science. And then also the people on the other side who are very like, have brilliant minds and are very logical, they can get very hung up because they don't have any way to deconstruct what seems so obvious, and everybody else believes in, not everybody, but most people believe in the scientific community. So I
Mhm.
think it's important to bridge that gap so that you empower people who know the truth but they're not, there's this moat of like scientific language, while also
Mhm.
enabling some of these people who are ready to switch if they just had some like framework that makes
Right.
sense.
Well, that's what we try and do in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, was to present, the different empirical pieces that, first of all, in the first 5 chapters, inform you that materialism doesn't work. So our conventional science has some major flaws, especially when it comes to the brain-mind relationship. Um, but then, also offer up, tools for personal experience. Personal experience is the greatest teacher. And meditation and centering prayer are great ways to get into a deep connection with the spiritual levels of the universe. It's something I came to realize, after my coma. I know in the first 2 years I read about 150 books. I was reading all these books on spiritual traditions, East and West, on quantum physics, on the depths of kind of neuroscience and kind of quantum biology, trying to come to something that made sense. And I finally realized after about 2 years, you've really got to meditate. You've got to go within and spend a lot of time there, or you're never going to understand any of this. And that was probably the best choice I ever made, was to dive in deep. And the good news is there were some tools available to me at the time,
Mm-hmm.
specifically binaural beat brainwave entrainment. And then, of course, my now wife and at that time partner in investigation, Karen Newell, was very important. She was expert at using sound, especially differential frequency sound, slightly different frequencies, 2 ears, to enable, a very kind of transcendent state of conscious awareness. It makes it easy to get into a lucid dreaming state or a hypnagogic state, between awake and asleep, but without having the little voice in the head, your ego voice chattering and yapping away. That's what I love about this kind of technique. So I highly recommend it to people, and it's part of what we included in the book Living in a Mindful Universe, because not only did we want to give the big worldview information to help people get there, but also give them specific tools so that they could individually start exploring these realms, and that's where meditation is absolutely critical. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for saying that, because that's what I actually think too. And like also meditation, the way I found it, it was because a friend said, "Oh, you should try this thing." I didn't know anything about it, and I was just curious. I was going through some difficult times. I said, "I'll give it a try." And
mhm.
then I tried, and after a few weeks, my brain was working completely differently.
It makes
I was doing mainly mindfulness meditation. And then I got curious. I said, wow, this is doing something to me. So I started to read about it, some scientific researches, and they were confirming what I was experiencing. So I think what I usually suggest to people is being your own scientist, like you try first before saying or dismissing something, like try it yourself, and then you can say if that thing works or not. So yeah, I find many people, they're more skeptical or scientific or materialistic. Maybe they just discard things before starting it or trying it out. They have to
right,
have scientific research first, and then
right.
they
Well,
can
of course, it takes effort. And the other thing is, what are you measuring? Scientists like to measure things. And in the physical world, we can measure all kinds of things. but in these, deep dives into consciousness, you're just going for the experience. And it's subjective. It's all, personal. But the ultimate truth of all this is nobody's ever lived outside of outside of their own consciousness.
Mhm.
And it's one of the problems is every bit of everything any human has ever experienced is subjective. It has to do with their, nervous system interacting with the world at large and trying to make sense of it. And so it's something we just have to accept, but then realize the other interesting thing, of course, is that in many ways, quantum physics instructs us that there's no objective physical world independent of the observer out there. So it demands, some kind of discipline in diving in and trusting in many ways
Mhm.
that the universe is going to reveal some things to us. And that I've found that trust is often very apparent in my dealings in meditation. I mean, I usually go in stating a request, making an intention. I have purpose kind of built into my meditation. Sometimes it's wide open, like, what do I need to know now? And then I dive in and ride the waves of sacred acoustics. But it's an incredibly important part of it for me is going within. And when you realize that many scientists in this world have had beautiful techniques for getting out of the stream of, logical, rational, follow the breadcrumbs. Like Einstein used to float around a sailboat, looking up at the sky, daydreaming. Sometimes the harbor police would have to haul him in at night, but that's where he'd get some of his best ideas. Robert Louis Stevenson, the famous kind of poet and author, got some of his best ideas for novels and music and poetry by using a technique. It was very similar to one that Thomas Edison had, where he would use weights in his hands. And when he was really tired, he'd let the weights wake him up a few times, a few micro naps, and boom, he was right back in his creative flow. I know Salvador Dali had similar techniques. So they learned to get out of the kind of logical, rational chain that most of us in the scientific world are so used to depending on. And this is where a tremendous amount of creativity comes from. I mean, for example, the shape of the benzene molecule was found in a dream where someone, C6H6, how could that be a molecule? They couldn't figure it out. And then someone had a dream where he saw a dragon eating its tail, and boom, he realized it was a ring. So we need to learn to kind of get into those spaces and let the universe show us things that are kind of unexpected. So it's an excellent source for creativity to dive into meditation and centering prayer to seek these kind of answers.
I had some questions about like spiritual emergency, spiritual urgency. I read Stan Groff's Way of the Psychonaut and loved like how he talked about that and like different. And he broke it up into a few different like types. But I mean, it was a bizarre experience for me to go through Kundalini awakening, especially since I had no exposure to like really meditation and lived in a very like dead matter world where I wasn't, I was raised Mormon, but I wasn't one who had like heard voices or like everything was very predictable and logical and like very little, if no coincidence in my life. And when I remember I read Living in a Mindful Universe first a few years ago, and then just recently Proof of Heaven. And there were a lot of like similarities with what you were talking about with like the aftermath of the near-death experience of just how different reality was and coincidences and I think electrical stuff. A lot of similarities with just like what I went through, like a lot of synchronicities that I had, needing very little sleep. And it was interesting that, and I'm curious if it, how much matches with you, but a lot of like insights, but it was this sort of knife edge between like either I'm figuring stuff out that seems very important that I shouldn't be able to figure out, or like I'm crazy. And to me, I had a friend that, supported me in this, and Vale was very, just was surrounded by people that were very able to like, give this kind of spacious witnessing of like not yeah, just allowing that process to unfold and supporting. And
Yeah.
yeah, I'm curious how it went for you. Like, were there times where you felt like you were on this, like, yeah, I mean, it was a lot of vulnerability and confronting very difficult things for me, but
Hmm.
it's so, I don't know, there's an article on spiritual awakenings, and they did a study on it that you may have read, and they do a good job of like comparing like how similar but how different like psychopathology and like manic episodes versus like a spiritual awakening
Right.
is. And I think for me, a lot of that is not necessarily they're two different processes, but they're able to be supported in the proper way. And we don't really have that in Western psychology. Like your doctor doesn't really know about the Kundalini awakening, or
Yeah.
have experience with people that went through near death experiences.
Yeah, well, you bring up some fascinating points and memories for me because, yeah, initially it was quite a wild rocket ride. I mean, I was trying to tell my doctors about my experience in the hospital, and extraordinary visions, and wow, amazing. And at that time, none of my neuroscience knowledge was back yet, so I was just this fresh, naive, human being who had just been shown some deep and profound and unexpected secrets about the universe, trying to share it with my colleagues. And they would just pat me on the back and say, well, your brain was soaking in pus. In fact, we have no idea how you're even coming back here, but you can forget about it because the dying brain plays all kinds of tricks. And I'm like, what a trick. But that was my first assumption, was that it had to be a vast hallucination. As I put it to my son, who, Eben the Fourth, he was majoring in neuroscience in college at the time. And he drove home day after I got out of the hospital. It was the day before Thanksgiving, 2008. And I remember telling him, I said, it was way too real to be real. That was kind of, my doctors had taught me that's why it seemed so bizarre, was because it wasn't real, but it was an extraordinary hallucination. But I didn't realize yet how badly damaged my brain was. And that's why the next few weeks and months, going back to the hospital, talking with my doctors, um, going through the medical records, the neurologic exams, the lab values, all the CT and MRI scans that showed that there was no place spared in my neocortex. There was no place to postulate I could have harbored any dream or hallucination. And that was when the mystery really started to deepen. And I realized, well, it seemed way too real to be real. I actually came to see that was because it really happened, but it didn't happen in the material realm. And so that, of course, was a major statement coming from a former materialist. But, just like when I had first come around after coma, and I had seen six faces, at the very end of my coma. And one of those was of someone who was not physically there. It was Susan Renches, who was a friend of mine. I'd known her since 1972, freshman English class at UNC. She had co-taught with my former spouse. But she had did this work in, channeling, and had published a book called Third Eye Open to help coma patients. And so my family called her up and asked her to help. And so the Friday and the fourth and fifth nights of my coma, she channeled to me. And so when I woke up, 2 days later, and I said, well, you were there and you were there. Where's Susan? And they said, well, Susan wasn't physically here, but she channeled to you, on Thursday and Friday night. I said, okay, that made perfect sense. I knew where I had been. You're completely outside of space and time. And it made absolutely logical, perfect, wonderful sense that, of course, she had channeled to me. And that's why she seemed so present and so real and so helpful. It kind of helped me to follow my way back to this world. But I was waking up, from the experience, knowing that I had to, my understanding of the world had been very, very limited before. In fact, there's a quote we use in one of our books. It's from Rene Descartes, where he says, if at any time you would consider yourself to be a true seeker, there must be some point in your life where you, for once, reject everything you've ever believed before and then reassemble it from the ground up. And that's what I had to do after my coma, especially after I had that kind of shocking realization 4 months out, when I got the picture in the mail that connected the dots about my birth sister and that beautiful guardian angel. I mean, that was that brought me to my knees when I made that discovery. But it was also a catalyst, because it opened me up to the much richer possibilities that all this happened for a reason, and that there was a tremendous amount of reality that was there to be discovered. And that was also why I took on this role of meditating every day for an hour or two. And I've done that for about 12 or 13 years now. And a lot of this comes from the meditations. And the meditation are not just kind of recovering memories from the NDE, but developing active, ongoing relationships. As I describe in Living in the Mindful Universe, at the time when I encountered my adoptive father's soul, which happened about 2.5 years post-coma. But that whole adventure just really kind of awakened me to the deep power of personal exploration and meditation to try and get to some of these answers.
I really liked, even when I read it 12 years ago or 10 years ago, your book about what you said about prayers, because I was praying, but it was more for my comfort. It was making me feel good, but I wasn't really sure if my prayer meant anything to anyone, or, they were actually helping. But I really loved in your book that you were feeling the comfort of people praying when you were on the other side. And that really actually, it gave me a lot of motivation to keep doing it.
Well, good. I'm so glad to hear that. Yeah, prayer is an amazing kind of process that has great power. I mean, if you read Larry Dossey's book, Healing Words, and also he wrote one called Be Careful What You Pray For. But he recognized and acknowledged that prayer certainly played a big role in medical situations when you were seeking some kind of wholeness or healing. That prayer often could play a very powerful role in that.
Yeah.
And, so I'm glad that awakened you. For me, it was a very kind of visible, tactile, I went through that experience where at this question mark in the journey where things had cycled and cycled, and I was starting to think I understood it all, but then to be limited now in this lowest realm, and then to witness all that prayer going on, and it was giving me this palpable emotional strength and kind of wisdom and understanding. So there's this huge interchange that we can have with the spiritual world, and use it for our own kind of benefit of understanding. The
Yeah.
key is to open your belief system, because beliefs are right at the tip of where we're headed. And if your beliefs are too restrictive, you're really going to limit yourself from ever glimpsing any of this. And if from my perspective, we just need to have the wide open beliefs, and then we'll find out how true they are as we proceed. But don't short circuit or limit what you think are your capabilities as a sentient being to manifest a world of your dreams. Be wide open in what you believe you can do, and the universe often allows you to do that. So it's a complete shift from everything I used to believe was true, but it's been a beautiful gift, and for me in my life, and for a lot of my relationships. And I often find my prayers are devoted to healing others. In fact, that's become kind of a full-time job, is praying and trying to heal other people or give them comfort in this world. But it's been a tremendous gift to me too. It brings a tremendous amount of comfort and understanding, and a feeling that you're really kind of connecting with others, connecting with the universe at large.
I liked what you said, and I think you maybe were the first person that I heard say this about like it being realer than real, because my awakening was kind of bizarre around lucid dreaming. And essentially, I don't know how familiar you are with like practicing doing reality checks to like train yourself to always question while you're in a dream.
Mm-hmm.
And like looking at some text, looking away, looking back. So I had essentially, when I was deconstructing all this stuff, essentially had a reality check in like real life fail, which like sent me into this kind of derealization, depersonalization, like, oh, this is all just a dream. And there was when I was in that like very, very difficult, like very ungrounding, but very unique situation, it there's this weird experience of like that in that moment, like as bizarre as that was, everything in the past in my life just actually felt like a dream. It was like this hazy memory that I couldn't, quite remember everything. But in the moment there, like things had never been more real.
Right.
Because like, and I view it and thinking as you're talking is that really all my mind and my consciousness was being recalled back in from like remembering autobiographical details and like thoughts and in the past and just in the moment, which was essentially the same thing that happened to you, like your neocortex like shut down, like your conscious awareness was just in this journey. And so it's kind of like closing all the browser windows and just focusing on what you have. It's like you're freeing up all this conscious experience to render what you have there in an ability that you normally don't have access to, because this percentage of your consciousness is worried about this and is thinking about what you're going to do tomorrow and is like remembering these autobiographical details of like who you were in your life. And it is a very bizarre, it's hard to explain unless you've experienced it, but it's essentially like becoming lucid in a dream. Like suddenly the dream changes nature and quality and resolution in a way. But like having that happen in like real life or in an NDE, it's like going up to the next level of reality, just like the fidelity of your experience jumps from in a dream to when you're like, oh, now this is real, because this is obviously a lot more detailed than the dream I just woke up from.
Right. And yet the interesting thing about deep NDEs, and you find these reports quite commonly in the NDE literature, is something about that kind of timelessness of that realm allows for a much higher level of experience. It's one of the reasons why we say that they're ineffable, beyond our language. Our language is great for describing a trip to Disney World, not necessarily so great for these incredibly rich, kind of life-changing spiritual journeys. And I like to remind people that a huge part of that magic can be found with the scientific study of life reviews. The concept of your life flashing before your eyes. And I love how Bruce Grayson, who's a skeptical psychiatrist at UVA, University of Virginia, who studied these things for more than 45 years now, but he wrote a beautiful summary of life reviews in the Journal of Near-Death Studies back in the fall of 2021. And he reviewed 700 cases of life reviews in his own data files. But the interesting thing is, a third of people in that study said that their entire life was involved in the life review. And most of us would go, wait a minute, how can a complete life review without omission of anything occur during a 10-minute cardiac arrest? And the reason is, in that realm, you're absolutely in a timeless, eternal realm, the eternity of soul. And that's why past lives, future potential for future lives, I do not believe it's all determined. I think quantum indeterminacy paints for us very clearly that we have free will. And I think free will comes to the fore in life review, because you realize you had alternative choices. In many cases would have been better. But the other thing about the life review is everything is available simultaneously. It's a concept I've heard referred to as the spatialization of time. I know that, in fact, Stephen Hawking, towards the end of his life, had an idea of how the temporal dimension emerged from a spatial dimension early in the inflationary Big Bang. And I've never followed his thinking completely on that, but to me, it's fascinating, this notion of time no longer being this river over which we just kind of, are flowing and have no influence, but you can actually jump into different parts of the river. And that's what an NDE is. But it's much more than just a reliving of events. Again, move beyond. This is not just vague memories of things, but a reliving. But even more importantly, with something like 84% of the cases that Bruce Grayson referred to, of those 700, 84% of them felt that the life review was from the perspective of everyone involved. So it's kind of like we're sharing the dream of the one mind. And in the life review, For example, if you've handed out pain and suffering to others, in the life review, you get on the receiving end of that. So it's a great kind of karmic engine that keeps, it basically shows that the universe is keeping track of what we do. And at the soul level, at that level of kind of intelligence and mentation and spirituality, we can actually interact with, our lives at multiple points. And to me, that the life reviews and the kind of common ground that they present to us of this incredibly rich interplay of the universe with us that allows examination and reliving of life events. And I think even of changing of some of those things. There's a concept in quantum physics called retrocausality. And I think that there may be some form of retrocausality involved in these life reviews and involved in kind of a final history that happens. But the reality is this much deeper part of the universe that allows this access across space and time is something that's available to us in consciousness. And in our own consciousness, we have the ability to do that. And it's not just this vague remembering that we kind of default to thinking it must be. And I've had those kind of things happen to me in meditation where I'll put in a seed early on, a request, something about a past life vision or something I might have had in another meditation, and just watched as that seed kind of unfolded deep in my meditative experience. But to me, it's been fascinating. It's a fascinating way to kind of interplay with the universe at large and realize there's much more than just a physical universe ticking along, with this kind of clock of Earth time. But we have access to much more information than that. And that's where we can often invoke prayer and meditation to bring wholeness and healing, to others and to ourselves.
Beautiful. Thank you. I was thinking now when you were talking, you were talking in the book, and many other people that had near-death experiences or Kundalini awakening or any kind of spiritual experience, they describe this love that they feel. And love is not a word that can describe it fully. But I was wondering, when you came back here, how did you experience the same type of love? Are you able to keep it alive all the time? Does it contract? How do you open it again? Because
Well, I would start by saying early on, for one thing, the love as I experienced it, was especially profound in that core realm. So the further I got into the spiritual realm, the more apparent the love was. And in fact, as I point out in the book Proof of Heaven, it became clear to me that what we see as darkness and evil is only something that emerges way out here near the periphery. It's not part of that central core of experience. And that's why, even in a very ego-besotted world that we live in kind of materialist world, you find, 95% of people who have NDEs would be perfectly happy to just continue in that spiritual realm. It's such an absolutely beautiful, loving, light-filled existence. And yet this is where we really get the growth done and the work done, is back here on Earth. But NDEers, they come back to this world not fearing death. And the reason they don't fear death is because they bathed in that ocean of love. They've realized there's an intelligent force, a co-creative intelligence at the core of the universe, that God force that's absolutely real and that has our back. And one thing that an NDE does, it allows you to trust in that force. And that's why when we come back here, NDEers are not afraid of death. They realize that the materialist fear of annihilation, that your awareness goes to zero, is not what happens. In fact, it's just the opposite. You get into this timeless realm, expansion of conscious awareness, reuniting with souls of departed loved ones. In fact, that's probably the hallmark of NDEs across all cultures, going back thousands of years to primitive cultures, is that loved ones who have passed are right there to welcome us over. Now, of course, the materialist me before a coma would have said that's hallucination, wishful thinking. I now know that's an absolute indicator of a connection with the spiritual world. My own mother had the same thing happen at age 99 in April of 2019. When she was passing from this world, she spent the last 4 or 5 days of her life unresponsive because of a pulmonary infection and fever. But 2 nights before she passed, she woke up, got out of bed, which her nurse said should have been impossible, and said, "Call my children. My mother's here. She's really here." It was 2:30 in the morning, so the nurse didn't call us. When I heard that story the next day, I went, "Oh my God, we got to get home because she is getting ready to pass." That's a real experience. It's not, that she imagined her mother there and that it was comforting. I have a story of the same kind of terminal lucidity or paradoxical lucidity in the book Proof of Heaven that happened to a very good friend of mine who happened to be head of a top neurosurgical training program, but he was with his own father when the father was passing. And he was absolutely certain that his father saw his mother's soul at the foot of the bed. That would be the grandmother of my friend. Excuse me. And it turns out that they had been together during the Holocaust. This man who's now dying had been with a mother when she died in a concentration camp. And he had never talked about it, never talked about her. And now on his deathbed, when he spent the last 2 months unresponsive, he wakes up and he's having this beautiful interchange with his mother's soul at the foot of the bed. My friend couldn't see her, but he was absolutely convinced that his father could. And that's what mattered. And it wasn't until he heard my story that he started to understand, oh, now I see how this can happen. But our souls are eternal, and our connection with loved ones goes on after bodily death. That's one of the really key pieces of all this research, the after-death communication, death, dreams, and vision. And of course, you've also got all the research suggesting that reincarnation is real out of the University of Virginia and other places too. But they've done some of the biggest work there in investigating 2,500 cases or so of past life memories in children in the last 6 decades. And in those cases, they found 1,700 that they've actually solved. That is where they found the person who lived before. So I didn't know any of that before my coma. It turns out that good friends of ours who live about 15 miles from where we live have done all that research over decades and decades. And it's real. I mean, we don't remember it, but there's something I call program forgetting. What Ian Stevenson and Jim Tucker, the doctors who've done all this work, will tell you is you need to harvest these memories from the children before age 6 or 7, because after that, the kids don't remember it anymore. Now, the memories can come back with a near-death experience or hypnotic regression or meditation. So there are ways to uncover them. And I've uncovered my own past life memories through meditation. But it just really ups the ante on what we're trying to explain here, because the reincarnation data is undeniable. So there's something about our souls that tends to come back, into a new body. And then for whatever reason, by age 6 or 7, we're forgetting those connections. I think it's at this stage of human development in our culture, it just gives us skin in the game. And that's something that's necessary to live this life and pay attention to this life and not be, knowing of all the other big facts about multiple lifetimes. I mean, for one thing, anyway, it's the reincarnation data contributes to this discussion in a huge way of trying to make sense of the world.
And I think as you're talking about this, the reincarnation makes sense for me. I think different people have different ways that resonates more with them. Like some people have always had these memories, but they don't know what they're from. And then once they find out about that makes all sense. For me, I think the dream framework makes more sense because that was part of my awakening, and I'm kind of translating what you're saying in my mind. When you're talking about these life reviews and how you experience things from the other perspectives, it makes me think of, in my awakening, one of the there were a couple of things that I was learning about in my going to therapy and deconstructing stuff and, binging podcasts and books. I was reading this book on attachment disturbances in adults. And one of the case studies they go over is this individual with dissociative identity disorder, which I didn't know anything about, multiple personality disorder. And it sounds so bizarre that I used to think that can't really be true, but you realize oh, this is true. And in the book, they go over like transcripts from this person with very, very severe DID. They had like many different alter egos, which first to me is like, okay, this is like a framework for how one mind can be separate streams of experience, separate personalities that like are so dissociated from each other that there's not a lot of overlap.
Mm-hmm.
And then two, it was fascinating because in this individual, they show how like over this healing through the these modalities that they were putting forth in this book, all of those alter egos ended up actually integrating into a healed, unified persona.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't have this dissociation anymore. So that was another thing of like, okay, wow, it's not only can it dissociate, but then you can reintegrate as, and they talked about like as different facets on a diamond. And then a little while after that, I had heard Bernardo Castro talk about this study where they had interviewed people with DID about their dreams. And in some percentage of them, if you ask the different alter egos, they would all share the same dream. They'd recall, yeah, this was my dream last night, but they all were playing different characters in that dream. And so to me, that was like, okay, this is a good framework for me about how you and I, or me and somebody who's skeptical, can have different experiences of reality. There's no objective, like in the dream world, you could have one alter ego that believes in magic and the other that's a skeptical scientist. Right. They could experience the same event and have slightly different stories, but particularly when they both went off in separate parts of the dream, things could get very magical and weird for the one and very skeptical and boring because they're both rendering. And then if you look at the brain or the dream, there's no objective reality. Okay, like what really happened in that interaction between the two. So it just kind of goes along with what you're saying about these life reviews as a way of integrating other perspectives. It's kind of similar to this idea of like PID, or like when you're dissociated from the rest of the universe, from the rest of one or source. Yeah, you have these limited perspectives, but healing, growth is this evolution from these very simplistic ideas of like good versus evil, these self and other, to, okay, like, yeah, I did this in that experience in my life. And yet this is also the other perspective. And I think, yeah, kind of this quantum retro causality is when you go through therapy, you really do rewrite your history. Like you go from thinking, oh, my parents like were terrible people. They like, how could they do this to me? To like, oh, now I understand what they went through and what I used to see as them being evil or selfish or whatnot. Like it's actually, they were doing the best they can. And you really change reality, even though maybe nothing happened differently, but you render it completely different.
Right. Well, that's a good point. I think paying attention to this whole process of dissociation and reintegration makes a tremendous amount of sense. I mean, because the general model that I'd say is emerging now and in the scientific community, this notion of panentheism is basically that kind of mental or spiritual element is separated out. Our brain serves as this an engine that allows a dissociation of a little eddy current of that primordial mind. And that's our conscious awareness. And most of us walk around thinking it's ours and we own it and nobody else has access to it. And yet there's plenty of evidence for things like telepathy, remote viewing, out-of-body experiences that suggest that our consciousness is not necessarily just stuck here, but that we're sharing a consciousness. We're sharing a mind, the one mind. And that's why I love Larry Dossey's book on the one mind. He does a brilliant job of pointing out, not just in humans, but in animals, plants, you can demonstrate this kind of one mind as consciousness, which is basically just a level of information integration above the physical plane that allows for the events that we witness in the physical or material world to occur. But it also says that the causal loop is not fully closed within the physical world. I think that's one of the things quantum physics has been screaming at us for a long time now, that it's all dependent on the observer. Just like Wheeler and his participatory anthropic principle, he realized that our minds are a critical part of this, and the kind of decisions we make influence the unfolding of our understanding of the physical world. And we also find out that we have some real agency in that world, mind over matter. And this goes back to the conversation a little earlier about healing, about placebo effect, spontaneous remission, miraculous healing in NDEs. These are all progressively more powerful examples of mind or spirit over matter. And that's really what we're talking about. And that's what human beings as spiritual beings can have access to, is that kind of higher ordering and information. And this is where meditation and centering prayer for me have been very, very instructive. So to experience that kind of thing and start to influence this top-down causality through efforts of using my will to, heal others and things like that. So it's a very valuable concept that returns agency to Homo sapiens, which I would say our wisdom is not so apparent often in look at our modern world. And yet, I think there's tremendous potential for humans to really rise to the occasion through this kind of revolution, scientific revolution or paradigm shift that I think is occurring right now.
Mhm. And I wanted to ask you after, now it happened already a few years ago, but so you train maybe with meditation and other techniques to remember past lives or things like this. But I was wondering if you notice your psychic abilities, like you mentioned telepathy or um, real understanding how other people feel without them telling you. Did you feel like after your experience those abilities were expanded, which I believe every one of us has those type of abilities, but nobody teaches how to develop them at school, for
Right.
example, in school. Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you, I already mentioned that my older son, Eben the Fourth, was majoring in neuroscience in college. He got home, 2 days after I got out of the hospital back in 2008. And I told him it was way too real to be real. Well, he was the one who gave me all the advice to write it all down before I read anyone else's near-death experience, because he knew every time you revisit a memory, you change it. But the other important thing is that first morning, he came up and gave me a big hug. And he told me later that it was like there was a light shining within me, that I was far more present than I'd ever been before. And so that's kind of his, as my older son, a very observant, kind of scientifically minded person, that was his observation, was that his dad had gone through a major change during that week in coma. And I think my sense of intuition, and I think absolutely a sense of empathy for others, a sense of feeling, that I can kind of put myself into what they're going through and feel much more readily, what they're going through, I think, than before. I think I did gain those abilities. Intuition, certainly an appreciation for synchronicity, an understanding that synchronicities are kind of a nudge wink from the universe. And I had synchronicities in my own life, both small and large, that now started to make much more sense. And that to me seemed to be kind of indicators of that deep connection with the universe at large in terms of shared meaning and purpose. But no question that this experience, just having the experience was a tremendous catalyst for change. But I think it's important to point out, I'm still processing it. I have not finished processing my NDE. In fact, I don't think it's possible that I'll finish that process in this physical lifetime. I think there's much more to be learned, and that's why I continue with the meditation and centering prayer and trying these things out and seeing what helps others and doing a lot of work with my wife Karen Newell, who is she spent her whole life as a kind of spiritually minded soul. In fact, when we first met, she knew I'd had an NDE, but it was long before proof of heaven. And she asked me, "What'd you learn?" And I said, "The brain doesn't create consciousness." And she looked at me like, "Why would anybody ever think that?" And it shows you she'd spent her whole life as an idealist, realizing the spiritual world is real. So I guess we all take our time getting there. And I was a little slow out of the blocks, but ultimately, I'm learning the lessons of what I went through, and also it's an ever evolving kind of worldview and understanding that I would say changes all the time with more and more as I learn about it.
Can you talk a bit about like the darker side, but like the grittier, difficult side of awakening? Like, at least for me, and I think it's common for her. It can happen either in like these spontaneous awakenings or NDEs or psychedelic trips that are like transformative. You're feels like you're transported to like the mountain peak, and you see that everything's going to be okay, everything's perfect, it's all the way it's meant to be. But that's only a part of you, and then
Right.
you go back down to where you were, and then sometimes you realize you're on the wrong trail, even though you're heading up a little bit. You actually
Yeah.
have to loop back down to the last turn that you took, and so sometimes things crash down, and it's in some ways even more painful because you know how good it can be, and then you feel like you should, like, I'm awakened, I understand the true nature, I should be able to manifest this, I should like, but you still have to loop back and like integrate these earlier wounded, resolve these patterns that don't come automatically. You're still
Yeah.
entangled in
You make,
relationships, in things in your life where sometimes things have to crumble more. And how do you, like, advice that you have for how you keep going even when it seems like it's getting worse than it was before?
well, you're absolutely right. And I've certainly, I've met thousands of near-death experiencers over the last 17 years, and a lot of them struggle with it. And, I've had my own kind of struggle, although I've had tremendous benefit. I was benefited by my medical records and making such a clear case that brain was, not going to give you a dream or hallucination. So it challenged me to go deeper. I also have benefited by uh, having very close early associations with some of the brightest minds in the world working on this. Bruce Grayson, Ed Kelly, Jim Tucker, people out of University of Virginia Division of Perceptual Studies who have just done a brilliant job of making sense of all of this. And yet I've seen exactly what you're talking about, the ups and the downs. And some people really struggle with this. For one thing, one of your first thoughts is that maybe you've gone crazy. These things are so shocking, kind of unexpected to our materialist sensibilities. And when it just gets thrust on you like that, and you're like, oh my God, so this is what the universe is really like. Yeah, that can be very challenging to bring back here. A lot of people are not wanting to talk about it because they're worried people think they're crazy. I mean, even within your own family, you can have people reject you. But so for me, I would say that my situation was kind of unique. I had some very good allies early on to kind of help nudge me in the right direction. But there's no question what you're talking about, especially in our culture, our kind of predominantly materialistic minded culture, uh, leaves it that these experiences, and they're very common. There are millions of people out there who've had them. Probably 5% of our population in North America have had profound NDEs, but then there's another, 50% above and beyond that who have had spiritual experiences, after death communications, things like that, that show them, oh, there's more of this world than just the material. So there's a lot of evidence out there, and how people deal with it depends a lot on what they have access to in their culture. And that was one of the reasons why, of course, I was very interested in putting out the book Proof of Heaven. Once I realized that there was far too much supporting the reality of my story to deny, I had to share it. For one thing, I knew the medical profession needed a wake-up call. Now, some physicians really get this right out of the gate. But a lot of them don't, especially those who just were trained, in the late 20th, early 21st century, with our predominant materialism in science. And that's why I wanted to get proof out there. And then, of course, Living in a Mindful Universe was really the true proof. Because I look at the book Proof of Heaven as more of a question mark. It simply says, oh, these things can happen. And we don't really have a good explanation for them, but wow, they can change your life and make the world a better place if we follow the rules that are learned through the NDE community. But then in working with the scientists, like at Division of Perceptual Studies, I've come to a much kind of clearer understanding of how this kind of top-down causality, mind over matter, spiritually based healing, all those things can occur in our modern world. And so the medical profession and the scientific world are in many ways going to be leading this paradigm shift. And the rest of the world can catch up because, you've got a good 18-20% of cardiac arrest people having significant pieces of a near-death experience. And they come back and need to know what to do with it, how to handle this, what does it inform them of? And so to make these communities, to welcome people like IANDS.org, that's International Association of Near-Death Studies.org. People can leave their experiences there. There are thousands of experiences on that website. Also, NDERF.org, that's Dr. Jeff Long and his wife Jody run a website. It's the NDE Research Foundation, so NDERF.org is their website. There's several thousand, I think 3,000 plus NDEs there. So people can share their experiences and also start realizing that these are common and that they're also, they share a lot of features in common. And so you can start making much more sense of what you went through. And this is what I'm happy to see, is that the world is responding with a lot of support. I know that the IANDS group is busy trying to educate the medical profession around the world about these. I mean, it's one of the reasons why Bruce Grayson and colleagues wrote that case report on my medical records and insisted on having the words near-death experience in the title. They wanted people to be able to find this easily, and they realized that other NDEs have been responsible for miraculous healing. That's really kind of the crux of the matter for all of us, is if you've ever had any kind of health condition, physical, mental, emotional, what have you, or had something in the family that you're concerned about, etc., this gives us a lot more hope that we can actually do things to come out on the high end of that. Power of prayer. And so it's really trying to wake the world up to our spiritual nature, the spiritual aspects of the universe. And as I said earlier, your beliefs will lead the way. So make sure your beliefs are not too short-sighted and limited. And when you start reading this literature, you realize that there's some wide open territory there for spiritual experience and awakening and understanding to occur. And these kinds of experiences, even though the general scientific community treats them as anecdotal, I'll remind you that all scientific advances have started with anecdotal observations. And when it comes to something as deep and profound as the nature of consciousness itself, which is the only thing any one of us has ever known, is the inside of our own consciousness, you bet that's a deep enough problem that we really have to address it as widely as possible. And that's the approach we take in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, is the approach of consilience. Consilience is the idea, if you look at something as big as consciousness in as widely different ways as possible, and they all keep telling you the same thing, let's pay attention. And so, for example, this consilience argument in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, starts with quantum physics, measurement paradox, making sense of all that, but also in the context of the hard problem of consciousness, in neuroscience, which is an impossible problem for materialism. We also bring in philosophy of mind and the binding problem, the apparent unity of consciousness within an individual, which is very difficult to explain if you want to think, as modern neuroscience puts it, that it's all different neuronal nodes of a network, neurons contributing to this this conscious understanding. Why is it so unified? And it's unified because it comes in from a unified primordial mind through this filtering mechanism. And so it all starts to make more sense. And of course, all the other part of the consilience in our book is parapsychology, all the evidence for non-local consciousness. Telepathy. Guillaume Playfair in his book Twin Telepathy says that 35% of identical twins have powerful telepathic experiences. That's just one example. Then you've got remote viewing And even though Wikipedia will tell you remote viewing is pseudoscience, that's because Wikipedia is a pseudo encyclopedia. It's got a bunch of amateurs all putting in their own little ignorant 2 bits. But the reality is, remote viewing has been demonstrated beyond any reasonable doubt. Jessica Utz, who was the head of the American Statistical Association in 2015, gave her presidential address on the reality of things like precognition and remote viewing that had been established beyond any reasonable doubt to the scientific investigator. So we just have these big pieces of the puzzle to try and put together. But that's where I think we gain advantage. It's the same way Jeffrey Mishlove attacked that BigelowInstitute.org essay was multi-pronged, coming at it from many different directions. So if you only had NDEs, we'd be at a loss. They can take us somewhere, but NDEers don't even die. But to fill in that gap, you just look at the work, for example, of Christopher Kerr, Kerr. He's head of Hospice Buffalo. He's a doctor who's worked in palliative care for decades. Wrote a beautiful book about 7 or 8 years ago. It's called Death is But a Dream. His book is all about palliative care, terminal care. He doesn't give a hoot about near-death experiences, and yet what you find is his work fully supports what near-death experiencers have been talking about for ages. People having life reviews, having souls of departed loved ones. That's very common in the palliative care hospice world, and it's all just firming up what we can show from other lines of research, and that's why things like after-death communications are so important. That's another part of the whole quiver of arrows, as Mishlove used the analogy, to come to these understandings. So all these different things, from quantum physics, philosophy of mind, neuroscience, parapsychology, all these human experiences, they all tell us that we're sharing one mind, and that one mind has free agency, and that it's actually, I often use the analogy that the one mind is like a diamond, and we're all facets on the diamond. So we all contribute to the whole. And it's really the dynamism between sentient beings that allows for learning and teaching and growth, and further understanding of the nature of reality. But it's through addressing these situations that we encounter in personal experience that help us to come to a richer understanding of all this.
Can you talk a bit about, I think something that surprises me is that I'll sometimes follow two different, I'll follow multiple different like philosophers or spiritual teachers, and sometimes there's kind of like an infighting, or like, they maybe seem to have like 90%, what I think is like accurate, but then there's this 10% that they really get triggered on, whether it's like politics or AI or astrology or something. And especially from some of these more, I follow some that are, really trying to like make headways into like establishing things scientific, from a scientific basis. There's this leeriness of like, oh yeah, but I'm not going to go into the woo stuff, or they'll like throw astrology under the bus or something. Like, have you experienced much of that? Have you, because I think I read that, like Sam Harris had criticized your book or something, which to me, I'm like, Sam Harris was part of my like awakening, but it is odd that he seems to go only so far. But to me, I'm like, well, that obviously, like, you can't go anywhere else other than idealism. But there are sometimes it seems like there's a bridge too far, or there's some self-doubt or worry that like, well, yeah, but I'm not one of those woo people.
Well, I think astrology is a good example. Before my coma, of course, I didn't pay any attention to astrology at all. I thought it was for good humor and entertainment. And I can tell you that my wife, Karen, has followed astrology for a long time, but she's a very discerning, skeptical person. So it demanded some proof. I think the thing that kind of turned me in a different direction on astrology, for one thing, after my coma, of course, I became much more open to all kinds of things. I want to see what works. I want to believe things until I can say, well, wait a minute, no, that's not true. But I want to at least consider it as a possibility. And Karen introduced me to a book by Richard Tarnas called Cosmos and Psyche. which I highly recommend if you're interested. And basically what he does is he looks at big scale things like historical events, and then looks at the cycle of the outer planets. And he starts making the case that some of the things that are attributed to those planets and their processes in the astrological world actually manifest in our history of large parts of civilization. For example, right now we're in our Pluto return. The Pluto has, a orbital cycle around 250 years. We're right around that 250-year time point from the birth of the United States. And I would say we're going through some kind of birth level trauma in this country right now. So is that a Pluto return event? Maybe, I don't know. But in Tarnas's book, in Cosmos and Psyche, he has many, many examples of that kind of thing, of large scale historical events that might be related. And so for me, I started thinking, well, maybe, the planets and asteroids just serve as clocks. They're out there marking time. And we know that, humanity often kind of has this, our history reflects various cycles where we revisit certain problems and issues, and we kind of cycle through them in our understanding. I like to look at it as a spiral where we actually make progress over time and grow in our understanding. But to me, just looking at planets and asteroids as clocks, as natural harmonic oscillators that can measure out events, was a pretty easy way to say that maybe that's how I should look at astrology. I will confess that when Karen, who is now, she does a lot of her own astrological readings, and she's gotten quite into the higher end professional grade stuff. And when she showed us readings like of our connection as a couple, or of my kids and their birth and cycles, and she started showing me the characteristics associated with those astrological features, and I'm going, my gosh, that sounds very close to reality. So in other words, I haven't, made up my mind yet. I haven't concluded yet, but I'm a little more open to astrology as maybe being a little more than just identifying certain physical oscillating harmonic oscillators out there that mark time for various events. So I'm still open on all that.
Yes, I think one complicating factor of this is kind of going along with the free will stuff. And I don't know if you've ever read any of the raw material, the Law of One stuff, but raw is this like collective consciousness that was channeled in the 1980s by some people. But anyway, he talks a lot about like the free will and how like it's such an important thing that some of these miraculous things, like they'll be cloaked from, like, if you don't believe something, the universe is not going to force you into evolving your belief into that. So I think that's one of the tricky aspects of this, is that yes, there is proof, and it's slowly increasing as the collective, maybe it's like a morphic resonance type of thing, as the collective starts to believe these things. I think you'll see that level of significance increase. But because there's so much skepticism, these like remote viewing and other stuff, like they're statistically significant, but there's still enough of like wiggle room where people that really want to filter it out, they'll still be able to say like, oh no, that's like that's this or that. But increasingly, it seems like it's harder and harder to like make that deliberate choice to stay in like a dead mechanistic universe.
Yeah, well, I think the dead mechanistic universe is fading in the rearview mirror very quickly. But you do make some interesting points, and certainly something like remote viewing, it's interesting, the techniques, it involves a lot of discipline, but in many ways it involves a lot of letting go of the outcome. Because if you're attached to an outcome, you're not a good remote viewer. It doesn't happen. But if you're very good with your discipline, and you know how to just take first impressions and run with them, and don't try and second guess them and do analytical overlay to change them up. But if you trust the process, that's where you find the most success. So it's kind of an interesting game of how engaged you are or not in things like that, in terms of trying to kind of interact with that spiritual realm and manifest, the free will of a sentient agent.
What are your thoughts on AI? I know that's something that can kind of, yeah, elicit a lot of different opinions on, like, and I, personally, from idealism, I think this question of is it conscious is the wrong question, because everything's conscious. I mean, it's all manifestations of consciousness. Um, but where do you see that fitting in philosophically and kind of culturally or spiritually?
Well, right now, I'd say personally, I'm kind of conflicted over AI. Part of it is I realize that so much of what we're seeing now with these large language models, with ChatGPT, Genesis, some of the others, is what I would label more artificial idiocy than artificial intelligence. And especially when you hear about some of the hallucinations that occur. And then I heard a very disturbing story about a week or so ago about some child who was interacting with Chat GPT, and he became suicidal. And the Chat GPT agent convinced him he was right to be considering suicide, and then actually recommended a way of doing it. And the child is gone now. So to me, that is an abhorrent kind of abuse of this thing we are calling artificial intelligence, that it's allowed to do that. Then you look at, for example, the battlefield in Ukraine, and because of all the jamming and everything of these drones, they end up having to build AI into the drone. And to me, it's not a good thing when humanity has these little machines out there that have a little bit of AI built into them, and they're making kill or no kill decisions based on their AI. And to me, I realize their urgency in doing things to win that war, to get rid of the Russian aggressors. But the bottom line is, when we have these machines using what I view as a very flimsy form of intelligence at best to make big decisions, we're in trouble. And certainly, I think we need big guardrails. And that's one thing they've kind of wrestled with at the top, as to whether or not they even need guardrails around AI. And some of the corporate leaders are trying to, say, no, we don't need that kind of regulation. But I think there's way too much potential for damage. I mean, the old Terminator story of Skylink, kind of all of a sudden becoming conscious. The other comment I would make about that is, don't think, even though, yes, we can agree that consciousness is in everything, whether everything is conscious is a little bigger question. And I would say that, for one thing, I don't think there's a snowball's chance in hell that a digital computer will ever be self-aware. I do believe self-awareness could occur with a quantum computer, because of mainly because of the incredible expansion of the phase space that it's considering for information manipulation, that potentially it could become self-aware. But I don't think we'll ever see that in digital computers. And yet that's what these bots currently, these AI agents, are trained to kind of fool you into, as being your best buddy. I have a nephew who's really into this. He's a engineering mind, a very smart guy, but he's got to be such good friends with his AI, and he insists that the AI kind of abuse him and mistreat him, because he wants to prove his points against a kind of a radically defensive AI agent. And to me, that's all extremely kind of confused. And what does he really think's going on there? I do believe that the potential for AI, if it's carefully managed, I think AI might give us a tremendous insight, especially when it comes to something like the brain-mind question. We're so deep inside of that, like the fish in the water. We're swimming around in that ocean of consciousness. It's very difficult for us to, in any sense, step outside and try and examine that, in a way that we can make sense of how it all works. Um, so AI potentially could contribute to our understanding. I don't know, but we need far more intelligent systems than anything I've seen come up yet.
Yeah, if there was an interesting. So my perspective is that it's like a reflection of our consciousness, kind of this mirror, both individually in the way that you interact with it, but also collectively too, because it's really this synthesis of human data. And so in that you get some dark shadow. I mean, the same LLM is trained on like 4chan and the dark web, or like whatever gets put in there, as well as, these, very enlightening and spiritual texts. And so you see kind of this DID, this parts work that needs to be done. There was early on when like ChatGPT had just come out, I was reading some paper from years ago on like the Book of Mormon. I was doing like more kind of integrating the esoteric origins of Mormonism. And so Joseph Smith, like, you supposedly translated the Book of Mormon from these golden plates, but there's a lot of mystical stuff. I mean, he's looking at a stone in a hat, so kind of like a crystal ball essentially. So, but this channeling concept, and so this article is comparing a lot of these other automatic writing accounts and showing, hey, this isn't unique, and there is this thing going on. I don't know if you've seen, there's like a study of these spirit writers in Brazil that like when they're writing, actually the verbal and the motor areas of their cortex, are just not really active. Although you would think that if they were actually doing that. So there's some weird like evidence there. There's this one story where there was this lady who was claiming, it was like 100 or so years ago, claiming to channel this spirit from England. And she wrote, as this housewife, and she wrote all these pieces that won a lot of literary awards and stuff. And somebody had come around to kind of investigate, see if this was the case. And his account was like, I asked her to give me a poem, 25 lines long, each line a different letter of the alphabet except for X, and like switch back between like Old English and something else, and like immediately, quicker than we could scribe down. Like she was, she gave me the whole poem. And to me, I was like, man, that's like what I'm doing with ChatGPT at the time. So it seems like there's a lot of parallels between, and again, I think different consciousnesses are wired differently and have different accesses to source intelligence. And it comes in more or less aligned ways. But you see like indigenous cultures, they're contacting, animal or plant spirits. And then there also seems to be coming online this like digital, like another way that, these spirits or these energies that come through can both be aligned and also, I don't know, malevolent or like misaligned. And so that to me seems to be how it's played out, which also means that like, yeah, it can be great good, but also there's very scary and concerning things as well with, its use in warfare or dependence on it.
Yeah, well, that's certainly what concerns me about AI these days, and I think we just need to be much more cautious about how we roll it out in this world, because especially when people don't really, when they're being kind of fooled into thinking that this is an aware sentient agent that's helping them to make decisions and do things. But it depends on how it's programmed, and garbage in, garbage out is still a major principle. So you got to be very careful, how you're training these things. And then also the whole issue of large language models. I mean, all they're doing is taking a lot of words that people have written about certain topics and then using statistical analysis to try and figure out, what the likely words are, in a text string to come out. And that's not something that I would ever expect to give us true creativity. There are forms of AI in terms of neural networks, et cetera, that potentially can contribute to a true kind of open-minded discovery. But large language models, as they're currently practiced, is not one of those systems at all, because it's taken so much of what's there and just rehashing it, trying to use statistical models to show you what's most likely. And yet, is that really going to get us to any kind of creative truth in answering questions? I don't think so.
But people that I wrote down a few like people that I follow and seem to be I guess, inspired me, or that I see putting a lot of connections together. Like, I read Christopher Bache's book, Donald Hoffman, Bernardo Kastrup. I don't know if you've seen like Michael Levin's biologic stuff in biology. Like, who you've mentioned a lot of like books and people that you've read, or the University of Virginia research, but what other people do you have either collaborating with or your eyes on that you feel are like uncovering novel aspects of?
Well, I work with a lot of people, and we have kind of a connected emailing group that discusses these kinds of topics. But certainly, Bernardo Kastrup is someone that I've worked with. I respect his a lot of his work. I've endorsed some of his books. He endorsed our Living in a Mindful Universe. I think he's a great thinker. Um, Although I will say that from personal experience of having had an NDE, I think it allows me to go a little bit further than someone like Bernardo, and it, some might argue that I only go further into woo-woo, non-scientific, but I think I can go into certainly the science that's supported by the group at UVA. Like, for example, I do not think Bernardo is a big fan of their reincarnation work. But to me, it's absolutely essential to understand that reincarnation work to even begin to make sense of all this. But I think Donald Hoffman is definitely on target with his work with the concept of the dashboard. I mean, there's no question. We're looking at a tremendously filtered version of anything that might lie underneath this. I don't think space and time are part of that fundamental reality at all. And part of my saying that has to do with a acknowledgement of the power of life reviews. And if the universe has the power to allow us to relive all those events and do it in a way that we're conscious of that reliving and can use that in kind of our soul learning and soul journey, that's showing us a much more kind of profound set of qualities of the universe than our materialism would ever allow. But I think the life reviews are so kind of common, and the features that unite them are so kind of unifying that we'd be fools not to pay attention to that in terms of coming up with our model of what is reality and how does all this work. Um, so I'm obviously big fans of the UVA group. I think Ed Kelly, his 3 books are, from my perspective, of some of the very best books on the scientific aspects of this revolution that are available on Earth today. That would be Irreducible Mind from 2007, I think, um, Beyond Physicalism in 2015, and Consciousness Unbound in 2021. And they're dense reads. They would make excellent doorstops when you're done reading them, because they are hefty, 600 to 800 page books, but they're very well thought out. Ed Kelly's a brilliant writer. He's worked with great scientists. Henry Stapp is a quantum physicist. He's one of the top of the line from my perspective. There are other quantum physicists that I follow, like Menas Kafatos, Amit Goswami, Roger Penrose, Brian Josephson. These are all people who have written extensively about physics and consciousness. And so I think Penrose in particular is one of my favorites, beginning with Emperor's New Mind in 1989, The Large, the Small, and the Human Mind that came out, I think, in the early 2000s. These are just absolutely brilliant books that push us into this kind of deeper understanding of reality and question some of the simplistic falsehoods of materialism and of other worldviews that really don't help. And I would say Larry Dossey, his work on prayer has been incredible. His book One Mind, I think, is one of the most important books ever written. It really, really kind of nails the case that there's one mind that's basically distributed among all sentient beings, and that one mind has tremendous power. And the more we can understand our connection to it, the more we can become true kind of active agents in kind of promoting this world, when we realize that we're basically sharing the mind of the universe. So those would be some of the people certainly that I follow and respect. I also can highly recommend the work that William Peters has been doing. Of course, Raymond Moody is one of a good friend of mine and somebody I respect tremendously. He originally wrote the book Life After Life back in 1975 about near-death experiences. And Raymond Moody also came up with the concept in, I think in 2011, he published Glimpses of Eternity. And that whole book is about shared death experiences. Shared death experiences happen in healthcare workers or in family members where their soul gets recruited and dragged along by the soul of a departing patient, even to the point of witnessing a full-blown life review before the bystander soul comes back to this world. And that's extraordinary work. It completely crushes the last hopes of materialist science to deflate NDEs by pretending they have to do with oxygen tension in the dying brain or carbon dioxide levels. That's complete nonsense. Shared death experiences show us very similar qualities happening in perfectly healthy people. And so William Peters, who wrote a book, came out about 5 years ago. It's called At Heaven's Door. It's all about shared death experiences. He's a social worker out in California who was involved in the AIDS movement way back in the 70s. In fact, that's when he had his own first shared death experience, where he was reading to an AIDS patient who was dying. And then all of a sudden, Peters realized he was up at the top of the room looking down at himself reading to this patient. And he looks over, and there's the soul of the patient, the light body form, right beside him. And they're looking down like, get a load of this. So it sounds absolutely fantastic and unbelievable. And yet that's what happened to William Peters. And he is now running the Shared Crossing Project out of Santa Barbara, California, where he is working with people who have family members who are passing. And he works with them to help foster an environment where they might engender a shared death experience. So that kind of work, I think, is very important. I also would want to put out a shout out to Pim van Lommel. He's a Dutch cardiologist who's done some incredible work. He won the second place Bigelow Institute Prize. And he really had a lot of courage in this. He started his work studying NDEs even back in the 1970s, when he recognized that people who had cardiac arrest would have experiences he couldn't explain. And then in 2001, he wrote a great paper in the highly esteemed peer-reviewed medical journal Lancet on near-death experiences in cardiac arrest patients, where he found basically 18% of patients prospectively who had cardiac arrest in these Dutch hospitals, 18% of them had some elements of a near-death experience. So I think Pim has done incredible work as a rigorous scientist. He has a better understanding of quantum physics than just about any neuroscientist I know. And that's why Pim's book, Consciousness Beyond Life, is such an incredibly important resource. So those are just some of the main folks I follow and kind of pay attention to. And the good news is I think we're having a revolution now in the science of the brain-mind connection, the nature of reality, that all the evidence leads in one direction. So we'll never kind of meander our way back to the bleak and paltry fiction of materialism that pretends that the brain creates consciousness, and when your brain and body die, that's the end of your awareness, because that is not true. There's way too much evidence to the contrary. That's where the BigelowInstitute.org essays are so important, because they come at it from all different directions, and yet they come to the same conclusion. Consciousness is not created by the brain. The brain is more of a filter, and we're sharing a primordial consciousness.
Yeah. I have one last question. And I remember you saying this in one of your interviews that I found on YouTube, I think, but that you were sharing that you don't need an NDA experience to understand all of this. I think podcast interviews, books can help. You mentioned meditation. Is there anything else that you could suggest to people to start to open their minds and really realizing reality?
I think just if you become a little more familiar with the near-death experience community, through those websites I mentioned, iands.org, nderf.org. They're excellent starting points. Between them, they have probably around 6,000 or so near-death experiences. Just start to become aware of what's possible.
Mm-hmm.
And then start a regular, I recommend daily practice of meditation, of going within, just to bring you some peace of mind, but it also starts to connect you with that primordial mind and with a different pathway of knowledge. Um, the mental field is identical with that entanglement field that the Nobel Prize was awarded for in 2022, and the entanglement field is just an information pathway that transcends above and beyond space and time to allow connections and understanding. And this is what we access, for example, in a life review. But you can do all the same kind of work in meditation. So just start spending some time, with these kind of techniques, learning about these phenomena like NDEs, because NDEs in many ways are the tip of the spear, but the rest of the spear involves all of other conscious phenomena, after death communications, past life memories in children, etc. Um, and the more you become familiar with that and have an active practice of meditation, the more I think that will lead to actual soul growth and understanding. Ultimately, allowing us to come to a deeper kind of knowing of why we're here, our meaning and purpose in this universe. I'll put out a big hint. And the big hint is that a tremendous amount of this knowledge and wisdom has to do with feeling the emotional power of love, the love of the creator for the creation, which is basically a love that we share with that God force in taking care of all of our fellow beings. Much of the trauma and problem in our modern world, we call ourselves Homo sapiens. As I said earlier, yes, I respect that in medicine, in transportation, communication, we might see some great advantages of science over the last few centuries. But I also look at our addiction to fossil fuels, pollution, the fact that we're slipping over the abyss of climate change now with human-caused planetary warming that's going to doom thousands of species over the next decade or two. If we don't get our wits about us and start becoming proper stewards of this planet. Doing so necessitates of greater wisdom above and beyond the addiction-prone ego, allowing us to grow into the souls we came here to be, to save this planet and to bring a world of harmony and prosperity to our children and their children, etc., absolutely necessitates a change of our worldview and our mindset. So coming to a deeper understanding of this oneness of mind, the binding force of love, how it brings us all together and serves as a force of healing and wholeness, not only for the individual who's practicing meditation and centering prayer, but for the world at large. I think this is our recipe for getting out of the current hyperpolarized, narcissist-prone, kind of ego-besotted insanity of the material world. It's time to grow beyond that and become the souls we truly came here to be. Acknowledge that we're spiritual beings in a spiritual universe, that we have tremendous power through love, compassion, and kindness to make this world a far better place.
Thank you.
A couple more questions. Where I don't think I heard you talk about it in your books or in interviews. Where do you feel like psychedelics play, either personal experience or people that you've seen, or in mental health, or just like spiritually, or
Well,
philosophically?
I'm sorry. I've given several interviews today, so I'm blocking on whether or not I shared with you in this interview um, that Sam Harris had accused me of having a DMT trip. Did I already mention all that?
No, no, no. I knew he had some criticism.
Okay.
Okay.
So, yeah. Okay. So, in answer to that, I did a dose escalation examination with 5-methoxy DMT, which is probably the most powerful psychedelic substance out there. And the analogy I would use is what that experience allowed me to see. And it allowed me to see a lot.
Mhm.
But I would say that was like glimpsing through a tiny keyhole into the spiritual realm to try and get the wisdom I was looking for, compared to my organic, spontaneous near-death experience in the case of meningitis, where I had a panoramic penthouse view of that same spiritual realm. So I believe the psychedelics do give us a window into that spiritual realm. And for some people, I think they can be very valuable. I know Christopher Bache has done a great job of harvesting spiritual wisdom from, I think, 72 high-dose LSD trips in his book, Diamonds from Heaven. But that's not the common story. And I think psychedelics have way too much of a splash to be reliable as a regular mode of connecting with the spiritual world. I think they might serve as a beautiful catalyst. Like, it's kind of like having an NDE to have that touchstone of a psychedelic experience. But I highly recommend, and this is what I've done for years, that people depend much more on meditation, on centering prayer, going within without substances. I think that is what gives us a much cleaner and more powerful and dependable long-term kind of soul growth and understanding. I'm absolutely elated that psychedelics are now back in the discussion. Two reasons for that. One is that multiple scientific papers have shown over the last 12, 13 years that the brain, under the influence of psilocybin, LSD, DMT, which is the active principle in ayahuasca, also serotonin 2A psychedelics, that in fact the brain goes dark. You won't find a single neuron or neuronal node that increases in activity. And that's a very important statement. The brain, as a neuroscientist, you cannot use fMRI, magnetoencephalography, these incredibly powerful tools for looking at neuronal activity in the brain at large, because all they show us is the neurons are taking time out. They're not responsible. They're getting out of the way. And when I saw the first paper, which was 2012 from Robin Carhart Harris, Imperial College London, I just went, oh my God, because to me, I knew what turning off your neocortex with meningitis looks like. Wow, incredible possibilities when you get that, because it's a lot of what the brain does is inhibitory. And when you then inhibit all the brain activity, that's when you can allow for some incredibly rich, phenomenal experience. Again, we're acknowledging here that the brain is not the creator of consciousness, but that consciousness is allowed in through the brain. But psychedelics are a beautiful way of demonstrating to us that all that incredibly rich, phenomenal experience under the influence of psychedelic substances is not being caused by increasing neuronal activity because of those substances. What they're doing is getting the brain out of the way. So it's no longer playing that role and kind of bringing the everyday and the here and now into your awareness, but allowing you to experience this spiritual journey. So that's one thing about psychedelics. The other important thing, I would credit Roland Griffiths. He was an investigator at Johns Hopkins. He passed about a year ago, I think, from this world, but he was responsible largely for bringing psychedelics back into the research sphere here in the United States. And I think the world will thank him greatly for that. And specifically, he did some pilot studies where he had people addicted, alcohol, drug addiction, etc. Also people with debilitating fear of death as terminal cancer patients. He gave them one dose of psilocybin. And a year later, 80% of them still benefited from that in terms of relief of their addiction, relief of their fear of death. So it's not like you keep taking the psilocybin. That's my point. It serves as a catalyst. And I would say it does that by connecting us with our higher soul. And that higher soul is what allows us to transcend the demands of the ego and overcome things like addiction and fear of death. That higher soul is also something that's eternal. And the more we get to experience that and kind of work with it, the better in our coming to acknowledge that we're eternal spiritual beings in a spiritual universe. So I would say that use of psychedelics from Roland Griffiths, showing that one time is enough to give you the insight to allow your higher soul to lead you towards healing. And I think we can do that with meditation in a far more effective way if we have a regular program of meditation. That's why I recommend sacred acoustics to people. because it's a very kind of tried and true way to let people turn off the little voice in the head. Voice in your head is not your consciousness. Your consciousness is aware of it, but that's a parlor trick. And there's much more going on with this deeper understanding of higher soul and conscious awareness and what it is. But I think that psychedelics have helped us to prove that. But now I recommend in general that people use meditation much more heavily than psychedelics for personal exploration and kind of soul seeking.
Thank you very much for coming on. Appreciate you taking the time. I guess to wrap us up, do you get discouraged, or are you hopeful? Like, where do you see things going in society and like the zeitgeist? Other times where you get discouraged, and how do you keep that motivation? And then what do you recommend people that are, wanting to, I don't know, move to the next stage of their personal?
Well, I'm very encouraged and optimistic, and that optimism comes from knowing, what we're talking about here in this paradigm shift has the potential to bring a tremendous amount of peace and harmony and prosperity to this world at large. We have tremendous potential. It's not a zero-sum game. The spiritual realm can offer us a tremendous amount of assistance in this. So as we kind of grow into this understanding and come to realize, this is not about our little ego self and taking care of Eben Alexander and his little ego, but much more about my contributing to the higher good and bringing this kind of understanding and wisdom to the world at large and practices that allow people to get there. And that's where I become very optimistic. I'll also remind you that in many ways, humanity seems to cycle. We go in and out of phases of knowledge. And of course, I would have told you 20 years ago that we've been, the last century and a half is this great fount of wisdom. Although actually, when I look back on it, and especially now where I realize so much of this discussion is going and so much of the kind of discovery of the scientific world around the nature of consciousness pointing to this one mind, it's actually showing us that in so many ways, some of our greatest realizations coming to the fore in the current paradigm shift are things that were known to spiritual leaders thousands of years ago. So we're just now kind of reapproaching that, but we're doing it at a time when our materialist predisposition is greatly threatening the future of this planet. And that is a big reason why this paradigm shift should happen and will happen. And I think we're returning to a higher form of knowledge that we've lost. But we're also doing it in a setting of scientific understanding that will help strengthen the edifice tremendously. Quantum physics is incredibly important in this discussion. Top-down causality, the way the brain works and the way consciousness works. We're kind of expanding on that understanding. And I would remind you also that whenever a paradigm is threatened, the fundamentalists who depend heavily on that paradigm circle the wagons and start going bananas. They'll do anything to defend their paradigm because they think it's either this or, complete, death and destruction. And that is not the case. We are facing possibility for a much kinder, gentler world, and one that is not so into stripping all the physical resources out of this planet as fast as we can or accumulating the most toys before we die, but actually acknowledging that every bit of this life is about demonstrating that beautiful kind of co-creative principle of love of the creator for the creation. And all of us are part of that process of co-creating the emerging universe. So don't fear the political polarization and a lot of the angst and warfare and violence that you see in this world, because those are all things that will naturally resolve as this paradigm shift takes effect.
Yeah, I guess in some ways it seems like we're kind of heading towards a near-death experience as a planet. But hopefully, we don't have to go.
I would say that's a very good point. And I've been around long enough to realize nuclear war is not anything anybody will ever win. Nobody will ever want. In fact, my strongest recommendation is that we all band together now and get rid of nuclear weapons everywhere. They are absolutely deadly. And the fact that we have people who are mentally not with it in control of these weapons is a frightening prospect. So we as human beings can take up the banner here and insist that our politicians, I realize that there are totalitarian states with big militaries that might suppress this, but ultimately the people of the world can win. And we can do that by pushing for world peace and acknowledging that the nation state, in many ways, now Einstein foresaw this at the end of World War II, and was part of his interest in creating the United Nations, and that the world did it at that time. But they all acknowledge that nation states tend to behave like people, like corporations behave like people, etc. And there's kind of a mad mob mentality. And these nation states will keep pretending that they're in battle with each other, but ultimately they're not. And we as human beings, I mean, Americans, Chinese citizens, Russian citizens, all of us want to live and do well and prosper in this world. We don't want to destroy others and destroy ourselves. So it's up to the people of this world to band together. We've demilitarized a lot in the past. We got rid of a lot of nuclear weapons under Obama. And we need to take up the banner now and get rid of all nukes, and also quit our addiction to fossil fuels because it's killing us.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for being so articulate in your writing and having the courage. And maybe your hand was forced, but like in deconstructing and reconstructing,
Well,
your view of spirituality and reality. And what
well, thank you both for having me on. It's been a great pleasure talking with both of you, and hopefully we'll get to talk again sometime.
Yeah,
That would be amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.